Good evening and welcome to MIT. It's good to see another large turnout. My name's Eric Adams. I'm from MIT in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I'm part of a 7-member group called the Freeman Committee that annually puts on this lecture. We do this with sponsorship from the Parsons Lab at MIT and the Boston Society of Civil Engineers section of BSCES. And the current president of BSCES will give us a few words about BSCES and civil engineering in just a few minutes. That's Bob Stevens. This lecture is in honor of John Freeman, who many of you know was an MIT graduate. That's Department of Civil Engineering back in 1876 when environmental was not part of the name, but he very definitely was an environmental engineer among other things. He worked locally on the original Charles River Dam. He worked nationally on water supply systems for the cities of San Francisco and New York and several smaller municipalities. He even had a hand in the design of the Panama Canal. Shortly before he died, he left some money to the society, which was to be used for the general purpose of educating young hydraulic engineers, generously interpreted. This lecture is one of the things we do to honor him with this fund. We also entertain small grant proposals from students and young professionals to attend conferences or do research work of some sort. And if you're interested in these kind of awards and what's been granted in the past, you're welcome to visit our website. That's most easily obtained by simply Googling Freeman Fund. That also has a list of previous Freeman lectures as well as an opportunity to download some of the more recent ones. I mentioned earlier that the Freeman Committee puts on this lecture annually, and what that means is basically that the 7 of us have one or maybe 2 conference calls, and we discuss who might be a good speaker. Somebody contacts the speaker, we establish a date and a title, and basically that's about it as far as we're concerned. The real work is done by our administrative assistant, and for the past 10 years that's been Gail Sherman. What that entails is a whole bunch of stuff. She's got to find the date for this venue, which often involves getting on a list a year ahead of time. She's got to contact caterers for the food, campus patrol to get permission to serve alcohol, talk to AV people to show this and to record it, talk to physical plant to get tables, make various types of posters and to send them, send out emails to various lists. At any rate, it's an awful lot of work. And Gail's been with us for the last 10 years, and unfortunately she's going to be moving on, and this is her last year probably working with a Freeman lecture. I think she's up there, and maybe we can use this opportunity to give her a round of applause. Thanks, Gail. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Bob Stevens from the BSCES, who's going to say a few words about civil engineering.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Boston Society of Civil Engineers section of the American Society of Civil Engineers, I just want to welcome you to the BSCES John R. Freeman Lecture, one of several premier events funded by bequest to the Boston Society of Civil Engineers to be managed by BSCES in perpetuity. As one of ASCE's most active sections, BSCES puts on more than 50 events annually. It's my hope you'll bear with me and indulge me briefly while I make the case for stewardship. I hope to challenge you all a bit that each of us is a steward of our profession, our nation's infrastructure, and an integrally linked sustainable environment. As a civil engineer, hydraulician, and pioneering expert in fire prevention and control, Freeman was such a steward. This word hydraulician is not mine. I found it in the write-up on Freeman from the National Academy of Science. To the students in our audience, I commend your career choice and encourage you that it is the career of the past, present, and future. The lifeblood of any free nation is commerce, and our nation's commerce requires a network of infrastructure. Recognizing this, the American Society of Civil Engineers has awakened a sleeping nation and media, and in bold fashion, claimed its stewardship. You're all part of that now, stewards of our nation's infrastructure. Our nation is remembering its essential needs for a functional, healthy, critical infrastructure and awaiting our leadership on it. What will you tell them? How will you lead? I would mention, as I did in my March President's Report, that Massachusetts experienced a second round of flooding in March, with many of the same issues exacerbated by the already high groundwater and surface water. The flooding caused hardship to countless residents and visitors. And while our sympathies are with the suffering, we should not miss this opportunity to realize the need for infrastructure investment, or we suffer in vain. On March 15th, a small privately owned dam off Pine Street in Canton breached. Elsewhere, Waltham's Moody Street Dam received emergency erosion protection and buttressing to reduce the risk of breach from overtopping. A state of emergency was declared in Freetown in February as Forge Pond Dam partially breached. The Office of Dam Safety solicited contractors for a controlled breach of the 200-year-old dam, completing the inevitability of years of neglect. Many were surprised by the flooding. The Blue Hill Observatory, which has recorded weather since 1885, reports March as the wettest month on record. But 7 of the 10 wettest months on record at BHO occurred in the last 15 years. The local climate appears to be changing. Over the same period, we've seen unprecedented development. These two factors have combined to increase flooding in New England. Our governmental leaders and the public are seeing the problems and asking the questions. We must remind them of the need for regulatory and financial commitment to address our critical infrastructure needs. Most of this year, with invigoration of the Government Affairs and Professional Practice Committee under the leadership of Peter Richardson, BSCES has championed public infrastructure investment as stewards of Massachusetts infrastructure. The signs are all there, and the media have caught on that our nation is in trouble while we ignore the deterioration and unserviceability and obsolescence of our critical infrastructure. Freeman invested his own fortune in critical infrastructure. In his March 18, 1925 bequest, after describing his motives, he wrote, "For the above purposes, I've been getting together some securities, and desiring the largest return for the present purposes, I have tried to safeguard this by broad distribution in the preferred stocks of 25 different corporations serving widely scattered communities. These largely are hydroelectric stocks. When one or another of these is called for retirement, I suggest reinvestment be made along similar lines." As our country and state awaken to the realities of deterioration of our critical infrastructure, opportunities will abound for people with solutions. Those solutions provide meaningful employment to those with the right training, some 30,000 jobs per $1 billion spent. They stimulate the economy by the expenditure, and more importantly, provide lasting means for the other sectors of our economy to thrive, as it has done since the first railroads crossed the Great Plains, the Rockies, and the Sierra Nevada, connecting the coasts. As much as we are stewards of our infrastructure, we are stewards of our profession. Freeman was a steward of our profession. His letter of bequest said, "It seems only fair that when one of us has found lifelong happiness and attained a competence from his profession, he should recognize the debt he owes to those who went before him and whose data he used, and should in some way try to help those who are following after." Our profession provides many opportunities. ASCE and BSCES are among them. BSCES is one of the largest sections of ASCE, which has over 146,000 members worldwide and is recognized as the leading professional association for stewardship of our nation's infrastructure. BSCES is dedicated to improving and maintaining roads, bridges, water and wastewater systems, schools, and other infrastructure that contribute to the state's economic vitality and quality of life. These are the organizations of our profession, providing opportunities for continuing education, technical publication, professional networking, friendship, and many others. They provide an opportunity to serve as well. A profession requires stewardship, and ASCE is the leader in stewardship of our profession. Among his many accomplishments and contributions, Freeman served as president of ASCE, elected at the 67th annual meeting. Thank you all for attending this long-standing BSCES event. I hope you enjoy this evening, a part of the legacy of BSCES. Eric?
And now to the main event. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Professor Stephen Chapra. He's from our sister department, Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts. Steve got bachelor's and master's degrees from Manhattan College and his Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. He has authored or co-authored more than 100 articles and reports and software packages and books. Perhaps some of you have used the Model Qual 2K, which is virtually the industry standard as far as modeling stream flows, water quality in streams. Perhaps you have used one of his textbooks, such as Surface Water Quality Modeling or Numerical Methods for Engineers in one of your classes. He's won a number of honors. He's also been nominated as the outstanding teacher in virtually every place he's been involved in teaching. His research and consulting and service on peer review committees has put him in touch with a large number of water bodies, ranging from rivers to lakes to estuaries. Probably the most sustained effort has been on the Great Lakes. And indeed, when our committee was considering Steve and he agreed to speak, we asked him if he could give us some ideas for potential topics. He's the kind of person we ask on the basis of who he is as opposed to necessarily what he has studied. So he gave us two ideas. And the first was an erudite discourse on eutrophication in the Great Lakes. And it was talking about the past 30 years or so of history of modeling and measurement, including such issues as nutrification, nutrient loading, water quality, chemistry, invasive species, and the whatnot. The second topic was rubbish, stink, and death. And so when we got these ideas back from him and we talked about it in our committee, it was almost unanimous that we thought that the more technically interesting topic would be the first one, but the better sell might be the second one. And so we hope we're not insulting anybody's intelligence when we pick the second one. At any rate, Steve has promised that this lecture will also have plenty of technical meat on it. Steve?
Okay, thanks, Eric. And thank you for allowing me to have that topic. This is the first talk I've given in years that has only one equation in it. And so I hope you don't mind. I mean, but in any event, I'll try to make this clear to you what this rubbish, stink, and death is all about. Okay, this is going to be probably the whole talk. I went through my slides, and I've done what every speaker does. I have too many slides, so I've made it modular. And this is a good, this could be where I'm going to end. And this is going to be the overview, the historical overview of water quality that the title talks about. If time allows, or possibly we can do it in questions and answers, I do have some material on work that I'm very excited about now in terms of simulating waterborne diseases. work that I'm doing at Tufts with David Goot and my colleagues there. But again, if you start to doze off, or Pete can give me a little thing like this, we can cut it at that point. I'm going to give you my conclusion that actually does relate to the part about the waterborne diseases, which I may not actually cover. But I feel very strongly that right now infectious diseases are dominated by the medical profession, and that there's a great role for engineers in that area. So regardless of whether I do talk about this or not, I'd like you to take that as one take-home message. Okay, but rubbish, stink, and death. Why does society care about water quality? Okay, now, I'm sure most of you are aware of Jared Diamond, won the Pulitzer Prize for a great book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. How many people have read that book? I figured it's MIT. You know, I figured that a few of you would have read it. His book Collapse, I think, is even better. But basically, this is a book about how geography influenced history. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. So I was thinking about writing a book about our profession. And when I thought about it, I want to get a catchy title. So basically, I thought Rubbish, Stink, and Death would really work. Now, I don't like to talk about my books before I write them. I find a lot of academics talk about their virtual books. You know what I mean? There's really never any book. And you go to their funeral, and where's the book? And no, they never did it. But just remember, if you ever see this one pop up in the New York Times or anything like that, somebody stole my title. Okay. Okay. This is the Daily Show, or Dilbert, of the 19th century. Basically, this is a cartoon from Punch, the satirical magazine from the UK. And this was an artist's depiction of the Thames in London in the middle of the 19th century. And you can see St. Paul's up here, so you can sort of place it there. So this is my setting for where our story begins. And I'm gonna explain rubbish, stink, and death. I tried to think of why I do what I do and why anyone cares about what I do. And when I asked a couple of my relatives who are not in our field, they came up with the death part. Everybody sort of gets that part. In other words, they want safe drinking water. But as I went through the history, I found that actually rubbish and stink are probably much more important than death, at least up until the current era. What rubbish means is aesthetics. People care about water looking good. So there's an economic value on water. If it's a known fact that if you give someone some water and it has a tinge of yellow to it, which may be caused by organic matter, may be completely safe, people will not drink that, and they'll drink something that's unsafe, or if something floats in it. Property values really hinge. We all know that if you have oceanfront property or something like that, the cost of your house almost doubles. Why is that? Because the water is pleasing aesthetically. So that's the first reason we care about it. Stink is interesting. Stink won't kill you. You can smell something bad and you're not going to die. But basically, people smell a smell, particularly when they're not in the survival mode, where they're middle class and they're living somewhere and they smell something bad, they want to move. Okay, and what the smell is telling you is that the ecosystem is sick. Basically, what happens in a water body is a water body can run out of oxygen, and if it runs out of oxygen, it winds up oxygen's called an electron acceptor, and it basically burns organic matter in the system. If oxygen gets depleted, it moves to other electron acceptors like nitrate and sulfate, and if there's sulfate there, the end product is hydrogen sulfide gas, which is rotten egg smell. So you may not see the dead fish, or you may not see the fact that there's no oxygen in the water body, but you will sense it by your sense of smell. And that tells you that the system is ecologically sick. And then finally, of course, death, that's the one that we relate to as human beings, and that's the idea of public health. And that's the third part of it. It kills you. You don't want to have water that kills you. If somebody at the end of this can come up with a fourth thing, I love triads, so I mean, basically, it's always good to get three. But if you can think of another reason why we fundamentally look at water quality, I believe that these are the three fundamental reasons that we do. So that's the basis of the talk. So getting historical about it, where it really starts is 19th century London. Before this point, I mean, you could go back to the Romans, and they certainly cared about water quality, but at least in Europe, in the Middle Ages, there was a great backward movement. And when you came to the point of the 1800s in London, there wasn't a high premium put on environmental things or water quality or anything like that. Now, what happened in London was the same thing that's happening around the world now in China, Brazil, all over the world. Because of economic changes, people went from an agrarian economy into an urban industrial economy. And so there's a massive migration from farms into the cities. Again, anyone who's been to South Africa or Sao Paulo or any of the major cities in China will see this. This is the London population plotted up in the modern era. And basically, if you look at that abscissa on there, I mean, the Black Death is in there. There's a whole bunch of things going on up until the 1800s, but it doesn't, you can't even see it above the axis, okay? But then what happens between 1800 and 1900 is you get this movement from about 1 million people to about 8 million people in 100 years. Now, when they came in, there was no urban planning. I mean, this is just what's happening in South Africa, again, Brazil, these shanty towns. Well, what happens in those cities is there's like a ring of shanty towns that go around the cities. In this, they came into the city center. So this is Dickens, and these are tenements, and these are people crammed into houses, and basically they're just trying to get ahead and make a living. Okay. Now, what is the water and sanitation infrastructure when they go and they do that? I don't want to be indelicate about this, but when the people come in there, they're going to generate waste. Okay, so here we go. Water supply was mostly wells. We don't, you know, here we have Quabbin Reservoir, where the water in New York City has the Croton and the Catskill systems, where we go and we pump really clean water in from the mountains. In this place, they actually, if you go to London, there are plaques around London that give you the sites of famous pumps that were in the middle of streets and squares in the town. So they would send out their children in the morning to go, usually the children, to go out with a bucket and go and get some water to bring it back to the house. So it's groundwater. The waste disposal is mostly cesspits. And a cesspit is basically a pit. And what they would do would be they'd take their sewage, and it would be a pit in their basement, or it would be in their backyard, and they would just take the night soil and come down in the morning and throw it into it. And if it got filled, it cost a farthing to have it pumped, and for a lot of those people, a farthing was too much to pay for that, and they would throw it out into the streets. There were no sewers at that time, except for storm sewers. So in other words, the only sewers they had was to basically prevent flooding. So you have, plus you have horses and all sorts of things on the street. So after a rainfall, the Thames would have an incredible organic loading coming into it. Absolutely no waste treatment. So it got so bad that there actually came a year that is called, in English history, the Year of the Great Stink. Okay, and it's 1858. And as in so many environmental problems, it represented a tipping point. This is a point that Diamond makes in Collapse, where what will happen was you will I think this is going to happen with climate change too, by the way. You outpace your environment. But, you know, you get the normal years. And then one year you get a drought, or something happens, and that's what pushes you over the edge. There have been a number of places where civilizations have actually gone defunct, the Mayan civilization, because they basically had a drought, and then that actually brought them to extinction. So what happened here was they had an exceptionally warm summer. Basically, all this sewage that had gone into the Thames estuary oxidized. There was no dissolved oxygen. It generated this incredible amount of hydrogen sulfide gas and intense rotten egg smell. This is a quote from Dr. William Budd, who's famous for doing some of the initial studies on typhoid fever. And so he made this, never before at least had a stink risen to the height of a historic event. Okay, now a nice part about this was that it's always good when the government's situated right by where the environmental disaster. I'm a real fan of Holland. That's one of my favorite. I don't know if there's anyone here who's Dutch, but of all the governments of the world, I love Holland because Holland, if the dikes break, there's no mountain where Bill Gates lives in the middle of Holland, right? And I think that's why their government is so good, because everybody's in the same boat. Well, in this case, there's Parliament, and this is where it was really stinking. And not the least of which, the Queen's house is over there. So what happened was, and this is really, Google this sometime, Google Big Stink London, and read about this. But what happened was, it was so intense that they went and they closed the law courts and the Parliament. They had windows huge, you know, it's the Gothic Westminster, and they put sheets up soaked in lye to sort of serve as some sort of a barrier. And for those of us who know about diffusion, that lasted for about 5 minutes. Okay, and after you start choking from the lye, the stink came through. And basically, Queen Victoria had a hissy fit over it, and when the Queen gets upset. So the point here is that this has nothing to do with death, okay? This is a smell. And what this did was it mobilized the forces in London, the political forces, and mostly middle class. Basically, it wasn't the poor people who were really up in arms about this. It was House Commons. And what happened was that they went and said, let's go and do something about this problem. Okay? Okay, so then what about death, right? Okay, so it's stinking, but these people are pumping groundwater, and they're throwing their sewage all over the place. So what do you think is going to happen? Pre-Enlightenment, of course, the paradigm for disease was superstition. You got sick because you're bad. I mean, you're basically, that was the old cop-out. You go sick, you did a sin, or something else like that, and that was the basic, their paradigm. Of course, what happened was then we go through the scientific revolution, so people are starting to think about Newton, cause-effect, et cetera, et cetera. What brought it to a head in London was that there were a series of intense cholera epidemics that took place from 1800 on as all these people piled into the city. Cholera is really terrible. Any of these diseases are horrible. But cholera is very dramatic in the sense that it's very, very fast moving. So what would happen would be whole neighborhoods would be wiped out. And basically they would just cart the bodies out and new people would move into the places. And so it's extraordinarily high numbers, comparable to the Black Death in terms of total amount of people who would die in these outbreaks. But they were in poor neighborhoods mostly. And so what happened as a consequence at first was that people weren't really generally as concerned about it as they were about the stink. Now, you can be scientific, but you can have a bad theory. Okay, it's like Einstein says common sense is what makes you think the world is flat. Right. Okay, so here's a common sense theory that they had at the time, and this was the working theory among scientists, was pollution smells, ergo disease, therefore disease must be airborne. And so here's another punch cartoon. This is the London Board of Health hunting cholera. And basically, it's probably hard to see those captions, but they go, the scent is strong here, there must be disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the hero in this case was a fellow named John Snow, who was a physician, but he thought like an engineer. And basically what he did was he invented the first GIS. He suspected that water was the cause of the disease, and it wasn't. And by the way, I just want to say, at this time, you go back to the scientific records, they have all sorts of meteorological measurements. They were trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing, and they were taking all sorts of data. And they probably could have had a model if they, or something like that, and because they were going down this wrong path. What he did was he looked at the data. And what he did was he went to an outbreak, and you see the way the crosshatches are going. Each one of those is a death. And he displayed them on a map, and this is just a subset of the map. When he panned back, he found out that the disease was clustered around a particular pump. And on that basis, that was circumstantial evidence that it was. And there's an apocryphal story, I believe, that he went out and took the pump handle off. And that's not, I don't think that's really true. But it's a nice story to tell your students, as long as you tell them you're lying after you go and you tell them that story. But the point about that was that he used data to go and implicate the fact that, and what had happened at this point was there was a seaman who had come home, and he lived in a tenement that was right next to there, and he brought home cholera, and he gave it to his family and his infant daughter, and they would throw the diarrhea and everything into the basement, and it had a brick wall adjacent to that pump, and it went through, and that's how it got into the water. Interestingly, if you notice, there's a brewery over here, and everyone who worked at the brewery, no one got sick. Yeah, and so all of you who've drunk beer when you were out there, the deal was that part of their pay was to get a pint of beer or something every day, and so they drank beer instead of water, and they basically didn't have the disease. It's just, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but basically after this, there was about a 20-year fight after this point that was because water utilities came in and were sort of contesting it and going back and forth just like climate change. And it was only when Pasteur did the germ theory of disease in the 1880s that basically science finally advanced to the point where they nailed it and they knew that it was a waterborne disease and they coupled it with the other. So what did they do? Basically, oh, and this, by the way, this is just the last one of my favorite punch types of things. I mean, it's pretty hilarious. They're looking through a microscope and they have these little baby rats floating around in it, but I thought that she's one of my favorites. Anyway. So what they did was they called on civil engineers. Okay, and it's like Bob was saying at the beginning, we're the infrastructure people. You won't call a chemical engineer. You know, if you want to design a Frito or something like that, you get the chemical engineer or a mechanical engineer or something like that. We work in the cities and we do the infrastructure. So here's London. This is basically where St. Paul's is. There's Westminster over there, and you can see it's a tidal river. You have tidal reversal over there. And so what they did was they commissioned civil engineers to build a great sewer network in the city. And what they wanted to do was get the stuff away from the houses and downstream of Parliament. And so those are just the main sewer lines. They terminated in Beckton and Crossness, which are still there. And what they did originally was they built huge holding tanks there, and they held the sewage in these huge tanks while the tide was coming in, and then they put it into the tidal estuary when the tide was going out. So the typical dilution, and it goes downstream, and who cares if you know what's downstream, right? France. So basically, okay, so, but the idea is solution by dilution. What happened was, though, there's still more people coming into the city, so eventually it actually overcame the assimilative capacity. And even with all that, they couldn't just get it out. It was still there and still causing problems. Okay, I just want to say that, again, I want to make that point that it's built by civil engineers with a civil engineering skill set to go and do this. Okay, but this is still vanilla engineering and civil engineering. And what I mean by this is that this technology had been around for a long time. Maybe there's a little fluid mechanics you come in, but it's basically just getting the slope right to make sure that the stuff goes away from what it's building sewers and tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's the same skill set, I believe, as classical, so there wasn't a real stretch. In other words, we could move seamlessly into this. And it's infrastructure engineer based on mechanics is what happened there. So then the next thing is, now sanitary engineering. Okay, now for those of the older people, the young people in the audience don't know, this is one of my heroes. This is Norton from the Jackie Gleason show. And when I was growing up, this was the prototypical what they called sanitary engineer. He worked in the New York City sewer system. And so this was where we came, what got us out of the sewers. And again, laying sewers is a very noble pursuit. Don't take this as anything pejorative. Actually, it's a good moneymaker. They pay you by the foot. But the thing is what got us out of the sewers and into the environment? What made civil engineers learn chemistry? What made civil engineers learn biology? Right? Because you can do F equals MA to do the sewers. Okay, so that's the next step. And the reason that we expanded, and we did this as opposed to ecologists or chemical engineers or anything, is rooted in the same problem that London faced. And it faced every major city in the world that was in a developed economy in the early part of the 20th century. And I call it the urban point source design problem. If you look at every major city in the world, and it's even to this day, every one of them's on a water body, whether it's a lake or a river or an estuary. And that's because transport, historically, the only way to transport large quantities of goods was by water. road systems just except ancient Rome, I mean, in places in China, basically this was all that they had. So you had your city, and of course, when they figured out Pasteur and if they took the water out of the river, they better do a water treatment plant. So we did water treatment plants in New England. We did slow sand filters in Boston and things like that. We did the networks to go and distribute the water to the towns, making sure the pressure was good for firefighting, like Freeman, like as you mentioned. And then what we did was just like London, we originally just used the river as a sewer system. Okay? But of course, whether it was a lawsuit from downstream or like Chicago, where basically Chicago put their waste into Lake Michigan, but they swam in Lake Michigan and they took their water out of Lake Michigan. Okay, so it wasn't going downstream, they were actually going and getting it back. They had to do something about it. So they designed wastewater treatment plants. Now, the design of every other part of that system, except the wastewater treatment plant, I would contend, is fairly straightforward. I can specify design criteria for you. I mean, I have to go and have enough water pressure with the water lines to hit the tallest building in the place during a fire, et cetera, et cetera. But a wastewater treatment plant can go between two bounds. The cheapest thing is don't do anything. Use the river as a sewer. But you can treat the water enough that you can drink the sewage. Okay, that's very distasteful, and now they're doing this out in San Diego and Las Vegas, where they're actually treating sewage and then bringing it and recycling it in to the town, and their politicians are saying you're being forced to drink urine. I mean, it's really, but if you go up in the space station, they don't bring Evian bottles up into the space station, right? We all know that you can use reverse osmosis or some sort of really high tech, and you can actually make the water cleaner than what they took out of there in the first place. So where do you go on this continuum? How do you rationally decide how to size your treatment plant? The way you do it is by, you have to figure out how much to remove, and you've got a residual loading, and somehow then there'll be some state in the system which is your critical concentration. And if you can link the waste loading to the critical concentration in some sort of a mathematical way, so you can do a calculation, cause and effect, you can and a biologist or a toxicologist tells you what a good concentration is. You can then back calculate and size your treatment plant to meet the objective. And that's what I do. And that's what Eric does, and that's what Pete does, and probably more other people in the room that I can't see, and Bill Walker I know is out there, et cetera, et cetera. We develop water quality models. And all that a water quality model is an equation. Okay, it may be a big computer model or anything else, but it's basically concentration as a function of loading, and then the physics, chemistry, and biology of the water body integrated with mathematics. Okay? So this, to me, it may be the history of my field, but I think this is really what was a huge impetus for, I publish about the Great Lakes, natural systems, we all do that. We're not just in a city with an infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. You're out in Boston Harbor, et cetera, et cetera. That's what brings us out there and makes us get a skill set that's beyond maybe a classical civil engineering education. Okay, how do we do it? We do it just like the structural people do force balances. Okay, we do mass balances. So I have one equation. Remember I told you there's no equations here. But just conceptually what we do, if we have a river, we've got our loading, we've got our concentration, all we do is break it up into little boxes. It's the simplest way. It's more complicated than this, but you can think of it as a bunch of beakers. And if somebody like Eric goes and tells me with the equations of fluid mechanics that there's a certain slope and there's certain forces on that, he can tell me how the flow goes from box to box. That's my transport. And I know how the stuff moves downstream. If there are some reactions that take place, we have a chemist or a biologist can tell us that. That's where the chemistry and the biology comes in. And basically, it's just like balancing your checkbook. All we are glorified accountants. I mean, that's what I was thinking about it. We're like with the IRS. I mean, we're just tracking mass and momentum and things like that in the system, which is what all engineering is all about. And again, right, so we can mathematically throw our loading in. We've got our concentration. We can size our treatment plant. Okay, now, the classic case of this was the Streeter-Phelps model. And that was Harold Streeter and Earl Phelps. Now, if somebody in the audience, okay, I know if I mention Newton, he's not going to stand up in the back and go, yeah, full of it, or anything like that, right? He's dead. But sometimes when you mention some of these, and I'm definitely going to mention some living people in this talk, I'm pretty sure, I know Phelps is dead, and I'm pretty sure Streeter is dead. Phelps was MIT class of 1899. I found that out. I found his obituary. If anyone knows about Streeter, does he have an MIT connection? They're both public health when they went and they did this in Ohio on the Ohio River in Cincinnati. Okay, and they did the classic back of the envelope calculation. If you notice when I went and, did you notice when I did my little diagram where I had the load in there? And then do you notice how I had the critical concentration downstream? Did that bother anybody here? It should have, right? Because you'd sort of think the worst place would be the outfall. And for sure, if it was a toxic poison or substance, that would be the worst place, would be the mixing zone. But when you put something that's carbonaceous, that's organic carbon, that's getting burned by bacteria, it winds up, it happens downstream. And they had a very elegant solution to this. What happens at first is this is the oxygen curve, and that's saturation. That's what the oxygen wants. That's where the fish are happy. It's saturated with oxygen, usually about 10 milligrams per liter. What will happen at first is when you put sewage into a system is that, okay, the decomposition dominates, and the oxygen will plunge. But then what will happen is you'll be undersaturated, and by Henry's law, you will cause gas to then reaerate into the system. And so what will happen downstream of that will be reaeration will cause the system to recover. Okay? So physically it makes sense that it goes downstream because biological reactions don't take place instantaneously, like maybe chemical reactions with equilibrium chemistry. This is as iconic as it gets in our field. We should make a t-shirt, Pete, of the oxygen sag. But this is basically when we teach our environmental engineering courses, this is what we show the students is this oxygen sag. And it winds up that mathematically this is a closed form solution that you can do with calculus, and you can actually get a closed form solution for exactly where that thing is located and how low that goes. And it's a function of how much loading you put into the system. So I love these old solutions. I don't know about the structures people, if they still do this anymore, but those back of the envelope calculations are oftentimes being lost with computing, but they're beautiful, okay? So let's regroup at this point before I do the rest of the history. So why do we model? So I've sort of given you, and what I've done so far is it's all problem-oriented. Typical engineer, right? We need a problem. So the first reason why you do a model is to do these predictive models. I didn't talk about cost-effective, but obviously that's underneath. You don't want to do too much. But we do the model to solve a problem to protect the environment. But an interesting offshoot of doing the models, which isn't to be underestimated, is the reason a scientist would do a model, is that models provide you with a way to get the big picture. And I find this to be equally valid to sometimes our narrow view of solving a problem is just integrating interdisciplinary information. Okay? If the Tufts has the jumbo as our elephant, and my students get a kick out of that. When you go and you throw this. We had jumbo from the Barnum Bailey Circus. Barnum gave us the elephant, and then it died the week it got on campus. Anyway, so they stuffed it, and it's a long story. But anyway, it doesn't go running around the field at the football games. But this is the parable of the blind man and the elephant, and this is well known. And the idea was that the blind men and the elephant were taken out. They couldn't see an elephant, they couldn't sense it, and because they didn't have the ability to holistically see the elephant, they misinterpreted what was going on, right? It's the forest and the trees type of a thing. Okay? Basically, the computer model is the exact same idea. Now, Eric, I know you're a great physicist and everything like that, and I know you wouldn't do this, but I have actually met physicists who will tell me that if you understand the physics of the water body, you don't really have to know the biology and the chemistry, right? And I've met biologists. I don't know if there anybody here's a biologist, but you meet a biologist and let alone if they have a favorite organism, like a particular zooplankton like Daphnia, they'll tell you Daphnia is the only thing that matters in the system and study Daphnia, et cetera, et cetera. And each one of them are real, and chemists will do the same thing, by the way. And by the way, that's no comment. I didn't stick him at the working end of the, I did this in alphabetical order, believe me. It was not for that. I love physicists. I'm probably closer to that than any other thing here. But the deal here is that that what the model does is it forces you, if you're honest, to go and be comprehensive about the system. And I'm not smart enough, and maybe some of you are too smart enough, but to use the model helps you to go and coalesce this incredible amount of information and then use mathematics to get your head around something that otherwise would be really impossible to understand. And this is getting a little ahead of me, but what's been happening lately has been that we've even broadened this thing out, and as I'll show later on, that beyond even the science, we're beginning now to actually make our models broader and take an even broader systems view in terms of it. And the computer and the mathematics makes this possible. That's my one equation. Okay, pretty cool equation. It's not that big. And basically, I'm an MIT for crying out loud. This isn't like it's like the Podunk Community College or anything. I don't have to, right? I mean, you finally feel like it's good that you invited me. I threw one of these up here. Okay, there's our concentration, there's our loading, but basically the physics are the flow. This is gas transfer, the reaeration rate, the velocity, and this is biochemistry. Those are the decomposition rates. And it can get a lot more complicated than this, but to me this is just very elegant to sort of put all these things together and give you the major feature of what's going on in the system. Okay, now what happened after this? This is the real watershed. Okay, first thing, make a point. Everything that happens up until recently, and probably still, but it's just the problems are getting broader now, has been problem-driven. So we're looking at societal goals, legislation, regulation, economics is really what drives what we do. We are not studying it for its own sake, as a scientist might. It's observation-driven. If you can't measure it, you can't model it. So basically improvements in analytical methods and probe technology and all sorts of things like that, particularly with toxic substances and with pharmaceuticals and stuff that Pete and I have looked at, that 50 years ago you couldn't measure it. And so basically now you're measuring it, and that's giving you the ability and actually dictates what we can look at reasonably. And finally, of course, computationally driven, both hardware and software. So this is the story I'm going to tell you. So let's do our historical evolution of modeling. I hesitate to use the term Sputnik because for the youngins in the audience, my students don't know what Sputnik is. They don't know who the Beatles are either, so don't do, they thought it all started with wings. But basically, this means pre-computer. And what this is really the Streeter-Phelps era, I could call that. What I want you to notice about this is we're doing the oxygen problem. You're looking at raw sewage. But the key here is, when I'm getting old, right? You tell your kids how hard it was when you were growing up. We literally rubbed sticks together when we were doing computations. When I went to school, we used slide rules to go do this. So solutions had to be closed form with calculus, and you actually had to go, and so that's why you did 1D systems, for example. Even if a system wasn't one-dimensional, you'd have to go and do things like that. But there were very elegant solutions. This is where people like Donald O'Connor and then Bill Dobbins, who is Pete's uncle. I didn't know if you know this, but Pete Shanahan is actually sanitary engineering royalty. I didn't know this until there, but he comes in a great tradition. But these were great mathematical minds, and they basically went and they figured all this out. Okay, next step, the Kennedy years. And this was basically, go to the moon, et cetera, et cetera. But what it meant as far as our field was computing. This was where I was educated. In 1966, I wrote my first computer program in Fortran 1. I'm going to die soon. I'm on roller skates heading downhill. But basically, what happened was that people like, and I know you all are my contemporaries also, we were the first ones who could actually get a computer to go and use it, and oftentimes you had to work for the computer center at your university to get access to it and use punch cards or paper tape and things like that. But what happened here, whenever you get a computing advance, it's always the physicists who jump onto it first. That's just been the way it's been in our field. So if you notice here, the kinetics are still linear. They still use the same stuff they could do closed-form solutions for, but people like Donald Harleman and Jerry Orlob and others came in and basically went and started to do 2- and 3-dimensional systems. But more importantly, they could take a systems approach. In other words, they could look at multiple effluents, start to look at optimization, use operations research, Pete Laux, Dave Marks, Lenny Ortolano, people like that, and went and did that. Okay, so huge, all of a sudden it's numerical. Okay, the next phase, the hippie phase, for want of a different. This was for all the people who are young here. I don't know, maybe it's now their grandparents, but it's probably their parents. This is where your parents went crazy, and this is where, when you look at the pictures of them when they grow up, there's this gap, like in the 70s where you can't find a picture of your parents. And, you know, I destroyed all of mine. I mean, plus I burned all my bell bottoms and every other thing. I'm like totally embarrassed. I'm so glad I don't have those. But somebody's going to find it someday and it's going to pop up on, you know, Google or something like that. But in any event, I tried to destroy everything. The deal here, though, that's really important was this was aesthetics. What happened in the 70s was, for the first time, there was a middle class in the United States, a substantial middle class, who had expendable incomes, who had vacation properties. My father, who was Depression baby, was a New York City fireman, but he had enough money to buy a bungalow on a lake. And my dad's very conservative and very right-wing, but man, if he saw some garbage on the beach, or if the beach looked like this, he'd be out there wanting to shoot somebody. Okay, so this was where Earth Day started. It didn't come from I mean, there were things like Rachel Carson, and there was an environmental movement, but a large part of why Richard Nixon went and did EPA was because of the fact that there was a constituency that cared about the fact that the lake looked green. And that's not going to kill you, okay? So basically, it turned to nutrients. This is where lakes came into because lakes are particularly susceptible to eutrophication. And so you have this pea soupy green type of a thing. But what happened here was the biology really got upgraded. And we had nonlinear kinetics, because you can't do biology with linear kinetics. Okay, and this is where I met Pete for the first time. Here's a picture of Pete and I back in, this was when you came out to the Great Lakes Lab. You were a graduate student at MIT. He was a lot swarthier. You want to stand up for a second, Pete, just so they could see it? He doesn't quite, but you could see the resemblance there, and that's me over here. And basically, we were both budding modelers at that time, and but we were engineers. And so what happened, though, at that point was that we had to teach biologists how to write differential equations. And are there any biologists in here? Admit it. Okay, come on, there's more. The same thing with lawyers. You're not the only one here, I swear to God. They just never, it's even worse with lawyers. They never admit that. But I love biologists. Some of my best friends are biologists. But you never teach a biologist to write a differential equation. It's like, what they'll do at first is they'll just be kicking and screaming every step of the way. You're the Antichrist. They don't believe it. It's too complicated to use math for, et cetera, et cetera. But once they get it, they can't stop. I remember Pete and I standing by Lake Ontario. We had a Canadian limnologist with us, a biologist, and we're there, we're trying to think about modeling Lake Ontario, and all of a sudden a duck flies over the lake. And the biologist picks out a pad and paper and starts going deduct dt equals, and he writes a mass balance for the duck. Now that's overstating it a little bit, but we know who we're talking about. There are people here who, you got a worm in the lake, you write an equation for the worm. And what you got out of that was these complicated food web types of models. And I have a little question, maybe we can do question and answers, what I feel about these things. Sometimes they get very over-parameterized. But the positive part about them was it really did bring you an ecosystem perspective, and we started to look at organisms. And if supported by good data and science, you can actually go and model this sort of a thing. Okay. Now the post-oil embargo phase was 1977 to 95. And what happened at this point was that prior to this point, it was the 60s. And it was throw money at the problem. You got a eutrophication problem, we'll go and we'll give you money. What happened was there was the Graham-Rudman bill. There were all these things about we had gas lines, et cetera, et cetera. Ronald Reagan became president. And it was all these things about budget cutting and balancing the budget. Of course, he didn't balance the budget. But you know, that was sort of the thing to go and do that. So what happened with EPA, and of course these were real problems, but they had to talk about death again. In other words, that you couldn't just go and use aesthetics to go and sell basically the pollution problem. So it was this point that people, and of course there were reasons for this, PCBs, et cetera, were in our water bodies. So toxic substances became the issue, the problem, and what happened was our chemistry got improved. The other one was acid rain, and that's the problem where you go and you study it so you don't have to do anything about it. That was just, and I believe that firmly. That was a thing with the Reagan administration, and they're doing the same, the same things happening with climate change where you can't prove it. And but the good part about it was there was excellent, this is where Francois Morel and Mintech and all those sorts of things came into water quality modeling. So we had this huge advance in chemistry at this point. Okay? Now, what are we now? 1995 to the present. I don't have a catchy name for it, but to me it's building the whole elephant. What's happened is that there are three things that are governing where we are today, and they're the clean legislation, regulation, Clean Water Act, scientific advances, and computing advances. And then finally, this last one that I'm going to talk about at the end of this first part of the talk, how am I doing on time? Just by the way.
You were handicapped by the slow start.
Okay, thank you. It was an excellent slow start, but okay. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. So maybe we'll stop at that point, or if you still want to go, we can go farther than this. Okay, first of all, the Clean Water Act. What happened with the Clean Water Act was when it first kicked in, it was really a pork barrel type of a program. What they did was they just gave grants to municipalities, the big municipalities across the country, to put in sewage treatment and to put in secondary sewage treatment, best practical treatment. But then there's a part of the act that kicked in the 90s, which was what happens after you did that if you still had a problem. And those are called total maximum daily loadings, the TMDL program. So that's pretty much governed what's happened. What has happened as a consequence is it meant that you weren't looking at point sources anymore. You were looking at non-point sources and point sources. What that meant also was that they looked at all the different problems and oftentimes had to look at the interrelationships between the problems. So it sort of forced a holistic view. For example, instead of just looking at receiving water, the way we would do back in all the other problems, all of a sudden you're looking at the watershed as being part of the system. You're looking at the groundwater for systems that have that kind of. In the past, we'd always tell it's negligible. Remember that? But in a lot of cases, it's not negligible, and it's really where a lot of this stuff is coming into the system. And in places like the Chesapeake Bay, which are sort of the landmark studies at this point, they've actually got airshed models, and they've tried to really do the whole. When they look at things like mercury, you have to really look at things like the atmosphere. Okay. Then the scientific advances. What happened was, and I'm going to love if you have a reaction to this. I think there were a lot of scientific advances, but the two ones that had the most profound effect on modeling were the following. First were the development of what are called turbulence closure schemes. And by this, what I mean is that prior to this time, when you would do mixing in a water body, diffusion, dispersion, it would be a fudge factor. It would basically be a constant that you would put in by calibration. What happened in these things was they linked it to the flow field. So they linked turbulence to actually the velocity of the water. I mean, that's as simple as I can put it. To me, that represented an incredible advance in our ability. And what I say is it greatly improved transport, and effectively, I think we can get the physics right. What this means now, some physicists have actually sold this and said when you get the physics right, you don't have to get the biology, chemistry right, and it's not you. But I've heard other people say that kind of a deal, right? You're moving the water around, but what happens is actually great physics exposes bad chemistry and biology. And what we're finding now is that when you get the finer scale physical thing, you have to have better biological and chemical realizations. They go hand in hand. And the other one is the sediment water closure. And this is Dominic Totoro of the University of Delaware basically developed this. And what happened in the past was you'd have something settle out of the water body, and then something would happen in the sediments, and you'd prescribe what happened, but it wasn't cause and effect. In other words, what went up wasn't connected to what went down, and what Dominic did in a very elegant way went and closed those things. So there are no loose ends in the model anymore. That was a loose end before where you could fudge the model. And so basically we can't fudge anymore. And I think that's a really good thing. Computing advances obviously made any of this possible. Hardware, no limits. What I mean by that is in the old days when we would do it, we do everything to work within a limited amount of memory. We do all this overwriting matrices and, you know, and figure out stuff like that. And we still have to do some of this stuff now with Monte Carlo. Efficiency is still important, but basically you can't just say, I can't do a three-dimensional computation because it's in unreal time. It actually goes slower than nature, right? You can actually go and do that. Software, of course, are the user-friendly interfaces. They're a double-edged sword in a way, but they certainly make it easier to use models. Graphics and visualization is probably the most important thing. In terms of a picture's worth 1,000 words, we used to stare at pages on pages of numbers, and you couldn't even see instabilities and things like that. When you see a plot, you can do that. Data mining, integrating models with GIS and database software. And what all that culminates in is advanced decision support. And the idea behind that, and I just want to say what this is, and this is really important, all these things up here, we can make them so we can drive the model better, the experts. But what an advanced decision support system is that it constrains, it puts an interface around the model that's a constrained interface, which allows the decision maker to interrogate the model and do what ifs without doing something that isn't sensible. In other words, to constrain them so it facilitates doing scenarios. And I think that's a major advance. The last one is the economic evolution. And again, like I said, we can stop here if we want, and I won't talk about the disease. But this is one place to go and end. And this is something that I've thought about an awful lot lately. It goes back to the idea of why you care about water quality. Obviously, if you have a continuum from a primitive economy to a developed economy. And of course, what happens in a primitive economy, and I see this when I go to countries that are basically you know, just back where we were in the 17th century. And survival is the only thing. But obviously, as you develop a middle class, as is developing in China and other places around the world, is that you're going to have a middle class, and eventually they're going to care about their children being sick, you know, long term, and they're going to care about smells and things like that. And so from rubbish, smells, and death, what's going to happen is you go to this other sort of a metric, quality of life, tourism, and trade. And so I just find this I do a lot of work in developing countries, so I'm still in rubbish, stink, and death. But in the United States, what I find an awful lot of the times is people who I don't expect would be environmentally oriented are environmentally oriented. And this has been a tragedy, I think, of Reagan in particular. I mean, I think he had I actually do think he's a good president in some ways. He was definitely transformative. But his idea about the environment and economics being antithetical, that they're being in conflict, which a certain wing of the Republican Party has pretty much espoused, is against the whole tradition of the Republican Party. I mean, if you go to Teddy Roosevelt, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'm saying about this is that this whole split is we can find natural allies in people who realize that they don't want garbage on their lawn. They want to have good property values. They want quality of life. And I think, for example, like a country like China, this is where China's going to they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart, but there's actually going to be a political, you know, people as their quality of life, you can't just give them consumer goods. I mean, they basically care what it looks like outside and how it smells, et cetera, when you go outside. So now I can stop at this point. But I can go very quickly through the rest of it. Okay, so I'm going to do it. 5 minutes. No, really, because there's no equations anymore. Basically, we've got this comprehensive framework, so that's the main thing. What's missing, though? Waterborne diseases. Did you notice that? We still do diseases, but it's people like Phil Geschwend, it's like, and like the stuff with the pharmaceuticals, where it's chemicals that basically can cause you to have cancer or birth defects or things like that. But the biological waterborne diseases are really not covered by engineering modeling. The current state of waterborne diseases in modeling is meager at best. I've done extensive literature reviews on this, and it is stuck back in the 60s. And it's amazing. And why is that? Well, basically because there's no legislation, first of all. We don't have big water. You'll have a cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee or something. It'll make the news for a certain amount of time. They'll do something about it. But there won't be the type of pervasive problem you do have. And like when I went down to Africa, South Africa last time, they gave me a cholera T-shirt. They had a T-shirt that said cholera on it. I mean, they weren't doing that because they thought it was a cool name. I mean, they're doing it because they have cholera. They don't have that in the United States. Are there inadequate measurements? Although this is changing. This is changing, but up to about 10 years ago, you never had bacterial measurements. They were going to get indicator organisms at best, but when you got to the actual species that causes diseases, but this is changing. But this is the biggest thing. Public health is considered a medical problem and not an engineering problem. Okay, so what I'm going to just basically tell you about it, just very briefly, is some of the work that I'm doing. And if you want me to talk about it more technically, invite me back, and we'll do all the equations and the dimensionless numbers and all that stuff like that. But this is the basic idea. Traditional water quality models, as I've just shown you, right? You've got these point sources in this river. But what happens are the sources are typically measured, and they're given to you. Now, with the watershed models, they've started getting away from that. But this is basically the way I live. I have to depend on some regulator giving me a value. There are a whole class of models called epidemic models that some of you may have seen in your mathematics and differential equations. They're classic nonlinear models, and the most famous is the Kermack-McKendrick model. So what it does is it looks at susceptibles, infecteds, and recovereds, and it's used for AIDS. It's used for all sorts of diseases. What happens is, you know, the susceptibles get infected, that feeds the infectious pool, and then it gets recovered. There are all sorts of variations on this where they get immunity, et cetera, but this is the basic idea. And so the types of calculations they come up with, if you look at a population in a city, is you'd have your susceptibles, you have the flare-up of the disease, and then you have your recovered, and you get that kind of a structure. I look at that, I see Streeter-Phelps, right? I mean, engineers love peaks. Okay, so basically we see something like that, and we see, I'd like to tell them when that peak's going to happen and how many people are going to get sick when they do that. But hardly anyone has coupled the pipes and the plumbing with this. So the idea is that what we've done, David and myself and Graham McBride of New Zealand, is we're writing a paper on this. We have one on Campylobacter, which is the diarrhea from cows and things like that. The other one is more a generic epidemic model, which shows you here. And of course, being who we are, we've developed software. So in other words, we've got that typical network model that you all know how to do. And it's just like Pete and I did with the pharma people in terms of the stuff there, where you just have simple sort of transport and you do a water cycle, but the cities wind up having disease from the water. The example simulation that I'm just going to show to you here is, look, we're going 100 kilometers in this river. Let's put 3 cities of 100,000 people each in there. Basically, there's 40 kilometers between each city. Okay, and what we're going to do is so it's 3-day travel time between each city. This is one of those ones, the names have been changed to protect the innocent or whatever. You know, like, I mean, this is a real. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and have a boundary concentration in the river of just a square function of 20 times the 50% dose response. This is the point at which 50% infection rate with like a Michaelis-Menten type of thing, Pete. And what we're going to do is go up to 20, so it's going to be this big shot of bacteria that are coming down the river. It's interesting, when we did this, we weren't thinking this way, but the first time I gave the talk at the American Public Health Association, somebody asked about terrorism. And I don't like to think about that, but this would be exactly what would happen in that case if somebody did something. What happens? Well, what happens is when you just do the calculation is that's the little blip. That's what I just showed on the last slide as being what the water intake is. And then this is what happens after it comes out of the city. Okay? We then have a plug flow reactor. So basically the signal is just transported downstream to the next water intake. Okay? And basically you get this expansion in the second city. Again, it gets transported down to the next city. See what's going on there? And then basically you get this enhancement here. So what happens is basically, this is the summary of it, the epidemic is propagated and intensifying. Cities are acting as incubators. I mean, basically that without the cities, with that kind of travel time, it just flushes right through the system and it's out in the Gulf of Bengal or, you know, wherever it's going to wind up going. Okay, now, there was no die-off in the river. So now now 1 per day with UV radiation is not a really big bacterial die-off rate. What happens if they die off in the river? So you see what's happening? So what's going to happen is the first city is the same, okay, right? Because we're just seeding that first city. But then the cities downstream get attenuated because of the die-off within the system. And if we go and then we put a higher rate, what will happen will be you'll actually get burnout. And so what happens is there's a combination of transport and reaction, and I'll show what that is in a second, that basically dictates whether or not you have a disease that's localized and stays within the one city, or which is transported and actually enhanced as you go downstream. And again, you know, this is just going to be a paper, and who knows if it'll be useful, but it's the type of thing we always start with, right, the back of the envelope calculation, because in every situation you'll have a specific numerical model that you'll go and you'll do. The amplification for burnout basically depends on the balance between the disease properties, the transmission and the recovery rates, the city properties, the population, their sanitation, and then the river properties, the travel time and the die-off. And basically, as in all the things that we do, we're not looking for a perfect answer, but David, forgive me if I'm dissing the public health people, but we went to this is my first, I joined the American Public Health Association, so I'm now a member, I get their journal, et cetera, but I gave my talk there for the first time. It was a great conference. They know a lot about disease, but I showed them this stuff, and they didn't exactly go, white men make fire, but it was, you know, again, because they're open loop, they're great people, and they know disease, et cetera, but they're not constrained by plumbing. Do you see what I mean? So a lot of this stuff is there's no boundaries on it and things like that. So I think this is my conclusion that I had, was that basically, well, I show this at every talk I always do, is George Box's quote, that this is, take my word for it, that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And that was the intent of doing what we're doing here. And I believe engineers in particular with this public health stuff, it's low-hanging fruit too. It's not like we're doing anything really new. It's just taking the tried and the true engineers approach to bounding things and bringing it in. And again, we have people like David and epidemiologists who really know these diseases. You go start talking to them, they really know the mechanics of how it, and they have a model in their head in terms of et cetera, et cetera. And that's why my final conclusion is this, and I mean this really old school engineering. It's going to be the computer models eventually, but just that back of the envelope type of thing that we bring to the table, conservation laws and mass balance, is going to really help. Thanks.
Questions?
Oh yeah, anybody. I saw the first. I'm like lit here. Maybe if I walk up here, I should have done this in the first place. Okay.
Somewhat different topic. There's a lot of interest in the impact of hydraulic fracking on water, and I think this is going to be an area of intense attention in the next couple of years because of the interest in previously unutilized natural gas deposits. So I wonder if you have had a chance to think about that area at all, and if you have any preliminary notions about whether this is something, the concerns that are being expressed, and that just a few days ago the state of New York had a decision about it, what you think about that situation.
I haven't thought about it in the least. No, and I don't mean that flippantly. But as I get older, I like call my shots now. I really mean this. This is really true. That's why I'm doing all this pro bono. I mean, all this disease stuff. I'm almost trying not to get funding, just because I want to support graduate students, so just calm down if you were in the audience. And so that's the only reason I'm going to go and do it. But basically, this is my next 10 years is going to be, you know, and then I'm going to go and, I guess, get senile or something. But the thing is that really the infectious diseases is really the area. So a lot of interesting new problems are out there right now. But frankly, that one in particular, if it's cracking, you're talking about injecting water down into the subsurface. I mean that I'm not an expert. I mean, I know how to do porous media generally, but I'm certainly not an expert in it. Is anyone else here who may be interested in it can go and chime in? But I'm a rubbish, stinking death guy. And that probably smells, though. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, you mentioned that all models are wrong, and particularly the biological ones.
Yeah, that's true.
But I'm just wondering, at what scope do you figure, that the models that you have these days, but with 3D and all the high-tech supercomputer, whatever you get your hands on, are pretty good? And the second question.
No, okay, that's a good first question.
Go ahead.
If you want to wait, we'll do the first one.
Go ahead.
And but that's a really great point, right? There's a hierarchy. There's like a food chain of science. You got physics, you have chemistry, and then you have biology. And I don't mean that. I think biology's harder. I mean, that's what I mean. It's a more difficult problem. For crying out loud, you have organisms who are agents. I mean, who actually can do things, et cetera, as opposed to molecules. And of course, chemistry, you can make like physics. And so there's that kind of a deal like that. And especially in water quality, if you're in a reactor or you're in some controlled setting where you have a monoculture or something like that, it becomes somewhat of a different ballgame. But when we look at it, the natural world, it winds up, like I said, with the physical models. I tend to believe the physics if you do the due diligence and you have good physical modeler and they really do it right. I mean, actually to the point where the physical models are now used for forensics. In some cases, there are examples where people actually detect underwater structures because of the output of a physical model. In other words, they get an anomaly. Where they, and so that to me is like, that really shows how good they are. And chemistry, if it's equilibrium chemistry, not non-equilibrium chemistry and redox and things like that, I think that's pretty good too. But then once you start to get into redox, we get anything biological, where there's an enzyme involved, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is that this is my philosophy, and there are people who disagree with me. If you're doing science, you can do everything but the kitchen sink. You're just synthesizing your data. You're not trying to make a prediction. But if you're making a prediction about biological, you need data. The data in the model, it is not F equals MA. You have enough uncertainty on the parameters that basically you absolutely need process measurements. So not just state variables going in time, but actually sediment traps and fluxes and things like that. And if you do that and you limit yourself and you stay disciplined to the things that you measure, there'll come a point at which your model balances with your data and you'll have a credible calculation. What I find, I'm not going to mention any names, but there's some people who develop software who basically put this deduct DT stuff in there. And God forbid if they have animation, people will believe anything. I mean, I'm not kidding. They'll go and they'll show an animation up on a screen and they'll show a bloom happening somewhere and you say, hey, do you have any data to show me whether that bloom works? So that's a little, so I don't know if I've answered your question, but, I think so, yeah. And the only other thing, I don't know if Ferdy Hellweger's here, if he showed up from Northeastern. There's really interesting stuff with biology as far as agent-based modeling now, in terms of actually modeling like you do a statistical thermodynamic. I mean, we actually model the organisms, individual organisms, and you use supercomputing to do that. And again, it's definitely a theoretical type of an exercise, but it's a Google sort of approach to biology. And I think there's some really, I think that's just an exciting, if I were young now and I was going into the field, I'd be working probably in that area. So if you want to counter or anything,
well,
but
the other part of this question
yeah.
is, to what do you think that distributed parallel processing might be useful?
Oh, you betcha, boots.
Right, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Where we find that.
Like home project kind of thing.
No, I mean, that's got to be, and it can be, what do they call it, embarrassingly parallel? Yeah. It's the dumb parallel, or they can have the smart parallel, but where we find it is with Monte Carlo and uncertainty analysis. And
a lot of people are doing environmental research on their computers at home when they're not using them.
Well, anything that you can do to go and, but again, the concrete example that I'm familiar with is that now I can do a simulation model, and I'm not doing your 3D types of stuff, but if I do a 2D thing, I'll get output out fairly quickly, almost in real time, where you can do what ifs. But once you start to do all these realizations that you need with a proper error analysis, sensitivity analysis, something like that, you have to do thousands and thousands of computations. And if you want to take advantage of the good transport, those are fairly massive calculations in themselves. And so parallelization is obviously the way to go. Things like that. Did I kill you?
I was wondering, what is that city behind it?
I don't know. I was trying to go for something that I saw in South Africa, but that was just off a web library. But I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, what?
The movie Slumdog.
Slumdog. But the place where where I'm actually doing work now is in South Africa, and it's amazing. I mean, it's in these cities. Any place that has like unclaimed land will be basically, squatters will get there, and they have vibrant communities, and they put these things up, and it's and no sewage treatment and no infrastructure or anything like that, and you can't take them out. I mean, it's not, there's no real alternative to it. So that's what sort of stimulated me to do this stuff with David in terms of.
What diseases are you fighting with your work?
Well, cholera is the one, but I mean, it's fairly generic at this point. That's something we'll have to talk about, Dave. We really, in a way, it's interesting that you can do the first paper that we're doing sort of theoretically, like disease X, that has sort of characteristic, because these diseases have different sorts of MOs in terms of the way. So what we're going to do is probably, it's almost more dangerous to call it a disease. You have a harder time getting it published because they'll think of reasons why it's wrong. But if you go and you talk about a disease that has these generic characteristics, so at this point, but Graham McBride in particular is looking at all the different dose-response relationships. But for the first things, we want to keep it not that many moving parts because there's so much of a tendency with these models to go crazy. In other words, as soon as you start talking to a biologist, I sort of made fun of them in a way, but that's because they know a lot. And they'll come in and they'll just start talking on all these nuances. And all of a sudden, you're doing fourth-order effects or something like that. And you get over-parameterized and right, you don't have any ground truth. So we're trying to keep it simple at this point. And it's still not simple, just by the way I tell you, it's nonlinear. So it's not going to be, yeah.
Have you actually seen field examples of that kind of cascade going down the river?
No, we're trying to find that there have been some classic disease outbreaks, but this idea of a propagation down a system. So that's why the Homeland Security thing is sort of a hook on it where it, and it's interesting mathematically. Sure. I mean, just, so from academics, we don't care, right? I mean, we really care, but I mean, part of it is that it'll get published because people will just think it could happen. But the point is, but wait a second though. But the other paper, which is on Campylobacter, which we're doing, that's being used. So that's a disease that's zoonotic. So it's the biggest cause of diarrhea worldwide. And it comes from cows and sheep and chickens. And it crosses over to human beings. So in New Zealand, and we got data for it, and they have farm after farm after farm down river systems. And so in that case, you're actually doing a steady state flow model, and you're actually watching how each farm can go, and we're looking at indicator organisms and CAMPI, because they manage the indicator organism with best management practices, but it has a different effect on the CAMPI, because it's ubiquitous, right? E. coli is in all of our, so that's like a thing that's always prevalent. And so I take that back. In other words, even though what we're doing might sound like a parlor game in a way, in terms of a theoretical calculation with the more dramatic disease thing that I showed here, the actual thing of then coming up with management decisions on how dense you make the farms. We have like a fly vector, sort of like how clean your farm is. right? So on the farm, you can actually have more clean practices in terms of the livestock, and that will go and cause less disease to go down the system. So yeah, we do. One of them is actually practical. Davey.
Oh, I was just going to say that in reference to the question about propagating disease down in the surface bodies of water, one of our colleagues at the Tufts Medical School, Jeff Griffiths, has looked at the Merrimack River and looking at cryptosporidiosis and the shedding of oocysts into the river, essentially looking at towns that then use the Merrimack as a drinking water source of all the waters. So there have been studies that are trying to calibrate this, but not in the sort of the classic sense of these.
Yeah, I'm talking to Pete a lot because we're real, separated at birth in terms of what we do for a living. But the problem is it's the classical case where you come up with some pretty math, and it's really nice, and you want to get it published. You need a little bit of data. Do you know what I mean? And so, it's like I'm caught in the position of hoping there's this really cool disease outbreak somewhere. I'm not even kidding. I don't really hope that happens, but it's sort of like with the thing with the volcano now. What did you think the first time you see the volcano? A tracer, right? There's going to be sediments all over Europe that's going to have this layer of ash, and they're going to know when 2010 was. Okay, so I'm sort of being facetious, but thank God there isn't a good data set. Okay, I guess that's what I should say.
In your presentation, you could mention about the state. You talked about Boston, how they used to flush all the sewage in Boston Harbor, which isn't a really bright idea when you're talking about tidal flats, where basically you have low tide, you would have all the solids there on the estuary, and it would be flushed out, like before the Deer Island wastewater plant.
You bet. And people here have played a big role, and MIT, in terms of the models and stuff like that they've used to do it.
Where do you think most of the people from Boston emigrated from?
But think about it. No, I can go back to my own childhood in New York City. I grew up on Staten Island. I was in the Bronx first until I was sufficiently beaten. And then we moved to Staten Island. I wasn't really a good fighter. I couldn't even run fast. So we moved to Staten Island. And there was a place there called South Beach that we went below the Narrows, the Verrazano Bridge. And we would go swimming there when I was young. And the New York City population was all raw sewage going in there. And it basically broke through. There was a point at which I remember swimming and going, Dad, look what's in the water. He goes, Gah! We all run it, jump out of the water. But that's what it was in the United States when I was growing up. I did sampling for the Indian Point Power Plant on the Hudson River. The best job I ever had, driving a boat, power boat on the Hudson River, and I sampled near West Point and Kingston and Albany. And Albany, I fell out of the boat everywhere else. Oh, whoops. I had my bathing suit on, and then I'd fall in all these other places were pretty, but in Albany, you didn't want to fall out of the boat. It stunk to high heaven. You'd try to net fish, and you'd just bring up those sludge worms would come up and stuff like that. So for the young people in here, you hear all this stuff about global climate change and environmental and stuff like that. The Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act were really good things. I think those are major, and engineers played a large part, but politicians, everybody who went and did that. I had asthma when I was a kid, and I swear that was due to them burning high sulfur coal and stuff like that. And you go to China now, or you go to Belgrade or something where they do a lot of coal, and I start to wheeze and feel sick. So that's, yeah, you're right. It's not but if, people weren't thinking then, right? Heck, they threw PCBs in the Hudson River. That's another thing. I probably have a lot of PCBs. I used to eat striped bass.
Moon Island in Boston Harbor has some holding tanks that were used to let sewage out on ebbing tide until the middle of last century.
Cool.
Just like one.
So where does that go, to Rhode Island? I don't know who the French are. Who the French are in Boston? Yes?
What do you foresee as some of the challenges in your sector given the effects of climate change as well as mitigation efforts? What are some of those challenges and opportunities in water quality management?
I mean, to me, in terms, and these are not things I'm going to be working on. I mean, I'm going to be working on these things which are going to happen. I think maybe these will be exacerbated by climate change. But to me, the huge things with, the first things with climate change are going to be these, the shifts, extreme events, and then shifts that take place in terms like the southwest part of the United States. I mean, which to me is, I don't know if anybody here is from California, but I mean, I cannot think that California and Arizona and Las Vegas and all those places are sustainable. So the distribution of rainfall, do you see what I mean? And distributions of temperature and things like that. I mean, but as far as my field, my area, I mean, we have the tools. I mean, if it's looking at extreme events or anything else like that, I don't see there being, I mean, I'm really trying to, I'm not talking just about climate change in general, because those are huge problems. But in terms of water quality modeling, I don't see necessarily, I mean, if you tell me the temperature changes, you tell me what the humidity changes, et cetera, I can tell you how much the temperature of the water is going to go up. And that'll change things as far as species. Maybe that's the biggest thing that'll take place. I know in the Rockies right now, they're having problems with water temperatures going up, and trout are very, very sensitive to temperature. Okay, so places that have fisheries are going to be influenced by that. But in terms of the actual technical part of the modeling, I mean, and my colleagues can go in and address that. Yeah.
What kind of guidance you are going to provide to those policymakers in terms of infrastructure planning or areas of business control?
Well, let's talk about infrastructure planning and things like that. And that's one thing I didn't really mention with this. And I think this is what you mean. And this may actually come up with climate change too, as a matter of fact. Typically, when we've used our models in the past, we've done this back calculation of how much to change loadings, right? That's been the game we've played, right? TMDLs, you look at loadings. But if you go to places like China, or you go to places like Winchester, around Boston, there are places that are built out. And if you want to, for example, the Aberjona River, which is the one that flows down past Tufts, the Mystic River, and those kinds of things, if you've got an urban drainage basin in Boston, you can't make the people leave. You can't reforest it or anything like that. So what happens is you do the best that you can in terms of like nutrient reductions and changing, but there's sort of a price you pay in terms of when you have a certain amount of urbanization, that the place is never going to be pristine pure. But what you can do then is to actually do environmental modifications. Case in point is I was on a committee that looked at the San Joaquin, the Stockton Chip Channel. Okay, it's the San Joaquin River, is the big agricultural river in California. And very powerful farmers who you're going to have a real hard time getting them to change their nutrient regimes and things like that. And what happens is the river comes and it goes into an engineered channel that's deep. And so a whole bunch of phytoplankton that have been growing in the river dump into this big, dark, deep thing, and they exert an incredible oxygen demand. And they have a salmon run that goes up the river. And so the salmon are impeded by the oxygen in that river. Okay? So we were on it to do a TMDL, and they were talking about going and doing a model to go and look at the reduction. So no, but then an engineer got up and said, well, why don't we just pump oxygen in? And so the idea was, and instead of doing the W, you actually do the physics or the chemistry or the biology. It's the type of thing where you would add chemicals to a lake or something else like that. And you can use the models to help you design that. And that was a case where they actually, I think that's what I don't know if it finally got in litigation, but that would be the most cost-effective way to solve the problem. It's already an engineered system. I mean, it's a pit. I mean, it's like the Houston Ship Channel or something else like that. It's not like one little pumping station that pumps oxygen into the system is going to be unsightly or anything like that. And it basically solves the problem. So models can not only be used to look at the W's, the flows, and the things like that, but to actually look at engineered structures and to then predict aeration chemical addition and stuff like that. So I don't know if that completely, the model doesn't give you the answers too, let me just tell you that. That's the other fallacy, is that that's the worst thing you can get is somebody who is going to believe the model, just mindlessly. But the model, if used to like be a ground truth, in other words, okay, here's a joke. I tell this joke all the time. I've been telling this joke for years. A scientist, a lawyer, an engineer were asked the same question, what is 2 plus 2? Okay? So the scientist said 2 plus 2 is 4. And the engineer said approximately 2 plus approximately 2 is approximately 4. And they argue, and finally they turn to the lawyer and they say, what is 2 plus 2? And the lawyer said, well, what would you like it to be? Okay? I actually heard that at MIT when Majors gave a course with Harleman and Dave Marks and stuff like that. Anyway, been using it for years. But the point of that is that we can serve that role of being there when people are arguing and they have like political things, because you'll see that, especially in a litigious situation, it's like, it's terrible, it's great, you know, and there's no medium in between. And what we can do is tell them approximately 2 plus approximately 2 is approximately 4. We can keep and that's what models can do. I believe, I should do a Pledge of Allegiance, I believe in mass balance. You know, there may be quibbles with the gentleman here who talked about the biology and whether you have the parameters, but I know water flows downhill, darn it. And so if I've got a model where I can actually keep track of things as they go down and downstream, there may be some other things wrong about it, but I know that if I got a good model, I know that's true. And that's really a valuable thing. I think that's what engineers, I mean, in this context, at least, I think we can bring to the table. Because again, I know scientists, I have a lot of scientists I know who are very good people, but some of them tend to be pretty open loop about how they look at these things. Do you know what I mean? In other words, that in the grounding that we have in terms of conservation laws and the fact that we have to balance mass and things. It's sort of like the accountants. You know how they got Al Capone? Al Capone was a gangster. I don't know if you know. He was like the worst gangster in the United States. They called him Scarface. And the IRS, he killed all sorts of people. They never could kill him. They got him on taxes because they had an accountant who followed the dollars around. So if we can help people follow the mass around and follow the bacteria around, I think that's that's what we can do. We're not the whole answer, but I believe it.
That seems like a good place to stop. Maybe we can...
I pledge it.